Welcome to the Minimalist Educator Podcast, a podcast about paring down to refocus on the purpose and priorities in our roles, with co-hosts and co-authors of the Minimalist Teacher Book, Tammy Musiowski-Borneman and Christine Arnold.
In this episode, we speak to Dr. Sheldon Eakins about his work in equity in education. We discuss what commonly comes to the fore in his work with schools and some strategies for us to all move forward in our journey towards equity. Sheldon Eakins, PhD, is the founder of the Leading Equity Centre. Dr. Eakins is also the host of the Art of Advocacy livestream and the Leading Equity podcast. Furthermore, Dr. Eakins is the author of Leading Equity, Becoming an Advocate for All Students. With over 15 years in education, he has served as a teacher, school principal, adjunct professor, and director of special education. Sheldon Eakins is passionate about helping educators accomplish equitable practices in their schools. He has earned a BS degree in social science education and an MS degree in educational leadership, and a PhD in K-12 education.
Welcome to today's episode of the Minimalist Educator Podcast. Today, Christine and I are looking forward to talking to Dr. Sheldon Eakins. Welcome to the show, Sheldon.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Sheldon does work with his company called the Leading Equity Center. And so we're excited to talk to you today about all things equity, because we know how important that is to our schools, our organizations, and working with people, because that's the industry that we're in. So can you tell us a little bit about how equity work became important to you?
One could argue it's been a lifelong journey. But I guess maybe when I became more intentional with the work is, I was living in Idaho. So I recently relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, like April.
Ooh, hot.
Yeah, definitely hot. It's crazy because I started off wearing suits every day, and all the locals was like, okay, you play around with them suits every day. And sure enough, I'm kind of like reducing it down to just shirt and tie. And as it's getting hotter, I might be down to just polo shirts because it's hot. It's definitely hot. But I like it here. But before moving to Phoenix, I was in Idaho, and I lived in Idaho for 7-8 years. And being a Black man living in Idaho, I could tell you some stories. And so I think that's when I kind of got a little bit more intentional. Started my podcast about 5 years ago. It's just because I was trying to figure out how to navigate life as an educator in this space. And not only me, but just like my teachers and staff and students, my own children were having all these different experiences. I didn't know how to really respond or how to help them and help myself. And so a lot of things I just grew up in the South initially. And so coming from Texas, like I knew exactly who didn't like me and where not to go, versus moving here. It was like a lot of undercover stuff. And so it was just like, it wouldn't be until later on. It's like, wait a second, what did they just say to me? And it's like, oh man, it's too late. Like I didn't know how to, I should have said something then, but I didn't know what to say or how to respond. Because I always assume that people have the best intentions. And so, but I didn't know how to address it without like being able to be able to have those kind of conversations. So I would say about 5 years ago when I started the show is when I became more intentional, but arguably it's a lifelong journey.
And so through this work that you've been doing with organizations and schools, are there some common themes, some common topics, some common areas that keep coming up over and over again that seem to be at the forefront of what the work needs to be?
So I would say this. Yes. So I would say that I tend to go into predominantly white schools. And when I say predominantly white schools, I'm talking about staffing. Okay. Now student demographics sometimes vary. And so we'll see some of the schools will have varying ethnic races and things like that, type of representation within their school setting. But often, if we look nationally, at least in the United States, we're I want to say it's like 83% white as far as educators go. And it's not necessarily like I'm here to discuss it in that perspective. It's just more we have teachers that are like, look, I don't look like the kids that I'm serving. I want to help them. I want to be as best as I can. What tips can you give me? And so that has been the I guess the overarching thing why people tend to bring me in. And then on the other end, sometimes I'll have individuals that will bring me in because they think they don't have any challenges. Oh, that equity stuff, that's national news. That's not our school. That's not here. Those are other schools. Those stuff you see on the news. Like we don't do those kind of things. Our kids feel very valued and appreciated. They're thriving here. And so I like to do an audit, which is an assessment and just a strategy. Okay, I hear what you're saying. Well, let's just take a look. Let's look at what the data says, and we kind of go through different areas like the mission statement. What does your mission statement look like? What does your professional development look like? What does your leadership look like? What is your staff and what is your communication? All these different areas that we touch on. And so there's another approach that I come with, I guess, strategies or support in that direction. So we do the assessment and then we look at it. We break it down and say, what are some things that we could do tomorrow? What are some things we could do 6 months? And then what are some things that might be a 1 to 3 year type of strategy, but at least we're making some progress. So there's some folks that believe that we don't have challenges, and there's some folks that know we have challenges, and they're just looking for sometimes just talking points. Sometimes people just reach out and they just say, we don't know what to say. What do we do when a kid says the N word and a black kid says it to each other? Or non-black kid says, like, how do we respond? It makes me uncomfortable. I don't know how to address it. I'm not a black person, so I don't know. I don't feel right approaching it or addressing it. So maybe I just pretend like I didn't hear it, but I see, so there's a lot of different layers there. But the first thing is you need to be willing to want to provide support or resources for your students, because ultimately we want them to thrive.
I really wish that I had known you when when I taught in New York City, because I taught in public school and I was teaching in a school in Harlem.
Mhm.
And like younger white woman, I'm still young, obviously. But working in a school where none of the kids looked like me, right? Like, so it was my first experience working in a school where it was mostly Black and brown kids. And we did have a very mixed staff, which was really great to be able to work with a mixed staff, because that was not where I was coming from. And so I learned a lot in that. But I think having an outside source to be able to help you identify the inequities in what you think is an equitable environment for your kids is so helpful. So like your audit that you mentioned is such a great tool to be able to use, because when you're in your bubble, right, you think, yeah, we're doing this, like this is how we're supporting each other and our kids and whatever. But then that outside perspective is so powerful, because you don't see a lot of the things when you're living in your own house. And so, yes, I really wish I knew you then, because it would have been so great to have someone come in and just help us with some of those things, those very things that you just mentioned. So you talked about using an audit as a tool to help people kind of see and go through what they have and what's not in place yet. Are there some other structures that you propose to schools to put in place right away, where you're like, okay, this is a really glaring issue. Here's a thing to just think about, because this could be the thing that changes that?
Well, I've been shifting a lot of my conversations and even workshops and trainings to just overarching creating a sense of belonging. I found that, with I would say probably since George Floyd, um, there was a big push for anti-racist work and anti-bias work, and then critical race theory started to come about, like on the other end, and just so much political stuff these days. And it's semantics is where a lot of things boil down to. And I said, okay, as a person who's known for doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, belonging work, what are some areas that we can find maybe some common ground? Because at the end of the day, we want our kids to thrive, right? I think we can all agree on that, whether, whatever terminology I utilize. So for me, I've started looking at creating a sense of belonging. I think if we can agree that at the end of the day, In order for our students to succeed in academic work, we also want to make sure that they feel as if they belong, feel as if they're included within the school community, as if they're accepted and supported. I think we can all agree on that. And so that is the approach that I often take is let's boil it down to what will it take for this student? Let's just take your average student. Let's take a student that's maybe not as popular. Let's take a student that tends to be pretty quiet or maybe a little off to themselves type of thing. What would it take for them to feel accepted, supported, included? And so those are the strategies that I tend to use. And sometimes that's conversations on what tokenism is, what does exclusion look like, what are microaggressions, what are implicit biases that we might hold, what are some things that we're doing unintentionally? Because again, we're assuming best intentions from our staff or those who are in front of kids. We're assuming they just oblivious. They've grown up in a world, they've grown up in a city or town where they just didn't have to consider a lot of things. And so it's just not at their forefront. However, how do I engage them in a way that they can recognize, oh, shoot, I didn't even think about it from this perspective. So that's the typical approach that I take. Sure, I have online courses. And of course, I have my current book, which is Leading Equity, Becoming an Advocate for All Students. And those are also extra areas for support. But I just think if we're just looking at it from a sense of belonging standpoint, we start there, that can lead to so many more discussions.
Yeah, that sounds really great. I love that thinking. But it's making me wonder about the role of student voice in this work.
Mhm.
So we're talking a lot about what the teachers can do, what we can do at a systemic level. So what role and how can we engage and include the student voice in all of this?
That's such a good question. Because at the end of the day, I can give all the PDs, all the professional development support for my staff, our staff, whoever it is. It doesn't necessarily mean that the student's experience is going to change. Because at the end of the day, kids are smart enough to know not to tease you in front of adults. They're smart enough to know not to say this, say that, or do this or do that in front of adults. So yeah, I did PD, and okay, I've been trained on how to respond when I see a kid get bullied. Okay, I saw it. So now I know how to deal with it, right? But then what happens again on the playground, lunchroom, and the hallways and bathrooms when stuff is taking place and there's nobody around? How does a student feel empowered to respond and stand up for themselves without getting into a fight and getting expelled or suspended, whatever that repercussion looks like? Okay, depending on whatever school setting. And so that is another piece that I've have discovered over the years. It's like, you know what? Yes, you spend a lot of time with adults, but the kids are the ones that are impacted the most with a lot of the stuff that you're doing. You need to work with them too. So I've been doing a lot of support for my students for that voice that you mentioned. I have a whole area of we call it the advocacy room, where we work with basically small affinity groups with students, maybe student leadership, maybe it's individuals within your high school, middle school that are looking for support for, okay, a student just called me a racial slur. How do I respond? So we take them through a lot of scenarios. Okay, kid said this to you. What do you do? How do you respond? How do you defend yourself? What is it called? We give them terminology. This is what a microaggression is. This is what social justice support. This is like various terms that you should know about at 15, 16 years old. And here's some strategies or scenarios, some ways that you can stand up for yourself in a respectful manner that's going to not going to get you in trouble. And then here's some ways that you can bring awareness to your administrator or your teachers. And so we help them. So we ask them in the beginning of our session, we say, hey, if money wasn't an issue, resources was an issue, what would make your school experience better? What would it take? And so they might list out of 4 or 5 things. And we choose 1 or 2 of those things and say, okay, so now these are 2 areas that you said would be better for you for growth. How do we present this to an administrator so that it's not just us complaining, but we're also providing solutions to them as well? So we help them put a whole PowerPoint presentation. Here's the area of challenges that we're facing. Here's some possible strategies to support us to make it better. Here we go. And so they present that to their administrators. That's that voice that we're talking about. sometimes I hear people say stuff like, we want to give kids voice. I don't believe in giving kids voice. They have a voice already. We want to make sure that we're listening to them and not listening to them on our own time. Come see me next week. We'll provide some space for you for this assembly, or we'll do this, we'll do it. No, they're coming to you right now. What can we do about it at this moment? At least say, you know what? I hear you. Thank you for taking this time. I need a little time to debrief or think about this. Can I get back to you? But at least I heard them in that moment and not say, well, come see me during my office hours between 9 to 5 next week.
I love that. Christina and I are such big, I'm going to say supporters, but that's not quite the right word. But we've talked a lot and done a lot of work around like student agency and making sure kids have just any opportunity in the classroom, outside the classroom, to share their thinking, their voice, their ideas. And obviously, all of this work is about them. And we just sometimes forget that, we overlook it. And so when we're in this kind of work, because it is it's a big thing to work on and bigger in some areas than others. So what are some things that even in schools that are really strong in their equity practices that are overlooked? Like, and I kind of mentioned this before, like when you're in your own little bubble, you don't see things, but what are some things that people either overlook as, oh, I didn't realize that was an equity thing, or like are a challenge for them to address?
I think like I would start with, what are some quote unquote traditional practices? So like a lot of stuff will come down to heritage, or this is what we've always done. And so it's overlooked in that sense. It's like, now I'm asking you to change it or look at it from a different lens. So while you might enjoy this activity, you might enjoy this event or this lesson that you do every year, and it goes well every year, but you've never considered or thought about how this might impact certain groups of people in a negative standpoint. And I'll give you an example. When my daughter was in the third grade, she had an amazing teacher, great teacher. He did an activity where it was basically kind of like your family tree type of thing, tell us where your family comes from. And so it was presented in a tell us or celebrate how you became part of the United States. So trace your lineage, your ancestry, how you became a part of the U.S. And they had a whole project. Now, he does this every year. What he didn't consider is people like me, when it comes to how we became part of the United States. That's not necessarily a story that, first of all, that I know about. Like, I don't know. Like, I've done my ancestry. I know I'm from West Africa, but my people were forcibly brought over here. Not necessarily a celebration that I want to have. And so my daughter comes home. She's like, Daddy, this is the project, and I don't really know how I feel about this. And she's in the third grade. And she's like, I don't really know how I feel about this. And I'm like, yeah, let's go to the school and let's talk to the teacher. What can we work out? So I went to the school, went to the teacher, and I said, I feel like this is a great activity. I know that you mean well. However, this is going to impact a lot of folks that aren't from European descent. And I said, well, you might have students that are excited to share their, my family came in from England and they're escaping religious freedom, or it's taxation without representation, whatever, right? Their background story was. That's great for them. And they probably have access to that information. They can ask somebody or they can trace it. However, my folks, we don't have that same experience. We don't share that same sentiment. And I said, in addition to me and any other Black student that you might have, there's other students, for example, that are undocumented in the United States. And so, again, celebrating how they became members or citizens of the United States, blah, blah, blah. They might have had to do some illegal activities in order to get here. Okay. Lastly, there's going to be individuals that were already here. Native Americans are in your classroom. So now we're doing this assignment that you love to do every single year, but you didn't think about how this might impact certain groups of people who have different experiences than what the overall. So you might have 30 kids in your classroom. You might have two Native American kids, one black, my daughter's the only black girl in her class, and you might have some undocumented students. And we're talking maybe, let's say, 5 kids that are going to feel as if they don't belong in this setting. I mean, just imagine being Native American and you got to watch all your peers celebrate how they took your land. Yeah, my family's fourth generation Idahoan. My family, yeah, that was my area. That was my family's area. We live on a reservation now. So, like, these are things that we don't think about. Like you said, always done it. We do it every year. This is our annual event. This is our celebration. This is our mascot. These are things that we do not thinking about it because it's always been done. And when I bring a lot of these kind of things to people's attention, they're like, "Oh my goodness, I never thought about it that way." And it's fine, unintentional, because you didn't have to. You didn't have, like, you just lived in a world where it doesn't make you a bad person, and you just never been privy to it. But now I'm bringing it to your attention. What are you going to do? I think Maya Angelou says something like, when you know better, do better. Because I legit will do sessions where I talk about racial slurs, and I'll talk about some of the stuff that we say all the time that has, I guess, racist origins, such as terms such as bottom of the totem pole, or off the, this person's gone off the reservation, or this, let's have a little powwow and let's get together and talk about it. These are things that we say all the time, very common language. But who are we talking about in a lot? Like, who's referenced? Where are these terms coming from? So I'll explain a lot of stuff where stuff comes from and the origins, and these are common language. And I legitimately have had assistant principals or even principals that say stuff like, well, other people probably don't know about these terms, so is it okay if I still use it? I'm like, you're a principal. I just told you this is wrong. And here's where these statements come from. Why would you still want to use, like, why would you still want to say it? Like, if you know better, do better. So it's these little things. And if I had time, I could tell you so many different things that we don't necessarily think about, that we just have the best intentions. However, once it's brought to your attention, what are you going to do with that information? Are you going to keep doing it? Oh, because no one else will know about it? Or are you going to take this as an opportunity to say, you know what? I just heard my peer say that. I just heard my partner say it. I just heard a colleague say this word. Hey, you probably didn't know anything about it, but you know where that term really came from and the impact it might have on certain groups of people.
Sheldon, we could talk to you for a few hours, but we try to keep our episodes about half an hour long, and we're getting to that point. So at the end of each episode, we do ask our guests we call it a pair down pointer. And so we've been talking, big things like equity is a big thing that we're working on globally. So if you were going to give somebody a pair down pointer to just say, like, if you're going to take your first step into this work, here's the thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always say start with yourself. In order to recognize that there needs to be changes made, you need to recognize that there needs to be changes made. Start with your inner work. I anytime I do a series of workshops and trainings, I typically try to start with implicit bias work. I do not believe that you can end bias. I'm a full-time consultant. I do this work all the time. Guess what? I have bias, right? So it doesn't make us bad people. It's part of human nature. Just who we are. But we need to at least try to recognize those things. And that's the first place to start, is recognizing what bias do I hold? And so what are some areas for growth? There's always room for growth. I don't care how long. I mean, again, as an example, myself, I do this all the time. I can always learn more, because at the end of the day, there's things that I will never experience. I will not know what it's like to feel gender discrimination, or I don't worry about walking down the street in dark, or getting ready for the camera and I have to put makeup on in order to be camera ready. I don't have to think about those type of things. So what biases do I hold? as a male, maybe as an educated male, English is my first language. What are some areas that I am already good that I don't necessarily have to think about? But if I'm not open to these conversations, if I'm just being defensive and I'm not prepared to have these kind of conversations, then what good is that going to do, not just for myself and my own personal growth and professional growth, but also for the students that I'm serving?
Thanks so much for that, Sheldon. And thank you for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
This episode was brought to you by the Leading Equity Centre. Leading Equity delivers an eye-opening and actionable discussion of how to transform a classroom or school into a more equitable place.
Be sure to join Tammy and Christine and guests for more episodes of the Minimalist Educator podcast. They would love to hear about your journey with minimalism. Connect with them at PlanZPLS on Twitter or Instagram. The music for the podcast has been written and performed by Gaia Moretti.